In this part of the course, we're going to talk about application hacking. Now, we've already considered system hacking, where we go after the operating system, and we've looked at network hacking, where you go actually after the network infrastructure that the host resides on. So now we're going to talk about the applications that actually sit on the box. Now, application hacking basically targets software and programs that reside on a system, and this might mean a server, it might mean a workstation, or basically any other host. In terms of software, you could conceivably say that this means databases, mobile applets, productivity software like Microsoft Word, for example. It also might mean any network-connected programs or applications that rely on network connections that maybe service remote clients. You could also say this applies to utilities and commands and so forth. So it really could be anything that sits on the operating system that's not part of the operating system itself, that was installed later. Now, application hacking basically takes advantage of weaknesses that could be in a program. And this could be unchecked buffers, it could be input validation issues, and so forth. And these issues could lead to things like execution of arbitrary code by the hacker. It could lead to privileged access and then later elevated privileges. It also could lead to unauthorized data access, where a hacker is able to access data they shouldn't and either delete or steal that data. It also, in the end, might lead to a denial of service condition for the host itself. Now, these weaknesses in the software applications, things like I mentioned, include unchecked buffers, lack of input validation, maybe even weak permissions or unsecure network connections. Maybe the application is using something like FTP or Telnet, for example. And weak authentication, weak password authentication possibly might be an issue. So in some cases, it might be weaknesses in the applications themselves, but in other cases, it might be weaknesses in the environment that the application sits on. And maybe the application is not prepared to deal with some of the things that it expects the OS or the network to protect it from. In any case, application hacking takes advantage of these weaknesses that I mentioned that are in the application itself. But typically, they are attacked through the network and the operating system. You don't just attack an application from a remote host. You've got to go through the network to get there, and most of the time you have to go through the operating system security mechanisms, things like the built-in firewall or permission sets and so forth. You have to go through all that to get to the application. However, if the application is weak and you have very insufficient protections on the network or the operating system, then you can get right through to the application itself. So that's an example of defense in depth, where all three of those levels need to be secured. Now, in some cases, exploit code might be needed to take advantage of the different weaknesses that could be built into applications. Things like small buffers or unchecked validation parameters and so forth. Exploit code could be needed to take advantage of those, but it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes just sending weird traffic or doing something that would cause the application to error out or crash could be taking advantage of a particular weakness in an app. Now, we're going to talk about buffer flows a little bit later, but basically they're one of the primary means to attack software programs, probably one of the more popular ones that hackers use today. And in this case, data is intentionally written to a particular buffer, possibly a memory address that will only hold certain amounts of data. And more data that it can hold is written to it, and it overflows that memory address, for example, spills into other memory addresses, and overwrites or corrupts that data itself. And this could cause an application to crash, or even in some cases spit up a command prompt. Now, mobile applications we'll also discuss, and they're increasingly becoming targets of hackers. And it really doesn't matter what kind of phone you have or tablet. It doesn't matter if it's an Apple device or an Android device or a Windows mobile device. It doesn't matter. All of these different mobile devices are susceptible to attack, to application attacks, as well as others. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. Web applications also suffer from some of these same vulnerabilities that we'll talk about, although in some cases they also suffer from others because of the fact that they inherently face the internet and are unprotected. So over the next few sessions, we're going to discuss a few things about application hacking. We'll give you a couple of demonstrations, and hopefully by the end of this chapter, you'll have a better appreciation of what hackers can do and maybe some of the methods they use to attack applications that reside on hosts.